what's culture, what are the cultural objects. And we do it. I mean, we know it. We know it because every single day, the way we interact with other people. And I like this conversation because it's like the fish, where the fish is surrounded by water. You don't see it, you don't think about it. And when you reflect on that, you think, okay, yes, everything we do is part of the culture. How you interact with people, how you talk, how you organize your thoughts, how you sit at the table, how you set the table. Why do you eat with a fork and knife and spoon and all these little accoutrements that we use for eating, whereas in other cultures they don't. They will just eat with their bare hands. You can have a conversation with that individual who is going to be very vulgar, or you can have a conversation with somebody else who you can enjoy it, and it can be enjoyable and relaxing, and it can help you. I think about it afterwards. I thought, yeah, that's crucial. In a way, it's not rocket science, because that's what we do. This is who we are, and that's what we try to do better in the conversations we have. So that's that. We're going to start by asking you and your listeners, what's culture? What do we mean by culture? And we're going to talk about culture. What is it? How we identify culture? What makes a culture or a person a cultured person? And more specifically, is a concept that some French sociologists developed in the 70s, and is cultural capital. So that's what we're going to talk about. And so what's culture? When we think of, well, he's a cultured person, or there is a lot of culture in this society, or I like culture. Well, what do we mean by culture?
I think that culture has a lot to do with people's habits, people's behaviors, people's customs, the things that really shape people into the identity of who they are as a community or as a society at large.
That's it. And then and those habits, then they get manifested. And this is what in the 70s, this French sociologist, Pierre, Bourdieu, and he collaborated with somebody else, and then he developed the idea of cultural capital, because as an individual and as a society, we have different aspects of our capital, or heritage, or patrimony. Traditionally, the parents passed on the land, physical land, to the children. And if you work on the land, if you cultivate it, if you tilt it, if you cultivated the land, that became part of your net worth. That's why you had to have a lot of children to work on the land, and then you could sell it, and it was a commodity. You can sell the product.
Do you think that there's a connection between the word cultivate and culture?
It is. So etymologically, it's related. And originally was cultivation of the land, and then you could sell the product or the produce. And then that in medieval times, it was extended to the culture, because basically you're also cultivating your taste, your habits, your intellect. And that's why this particular individual, the sociologist, talked about, okay, you can have the economic capital, the land, or you buy something, you can sell it. But then he talks about also the cultural capital and the sociological capital. The sociological capital, maybe the prestige of some individual, you can even monetize that, you can profit from that prestige of that individual. But most importantly, he realized that the elite, the true elite, or the bourgeoisie in some countries, in France specifically, they were not passing on the land per se in itself to the children. It was more to do with the culture, the education, the knowledge. And it's the experience that your parents, or as a society, you are passing on to your children. That's why you go to school, to primary school, secondary school, then you go to college or university. In primary school, to learn how to read, how to write, because as a society, we value that knowledge. So what is the cultural capital? It's all the wealth of knowledge and skills that you acquire. And then you can monetize, you can profit from those skills. What are the skills? What do we value as a society? Well, education, for starters, knowing the language or languages, or if you have sciences or humanities. As a society, we say, well, I'm studying mathematics. And we say, I'm a mathematician. We value that. And then once you know mathematics, you can become an accountant, or you can put that knowledge, you can have a profession. And we value that. In humanities, it's very much the same. We say, okay, he's a philosopher, and he has written 20 books about philosophy, and he can understand how we operate, why we do the things we do. Or we say, I study psychology. And as a society, we value that. And or even knowing languages. So we value certain skills, and even knowing languages. For example, when we say this person knows 6 languages, that in itself, we value that. And the question that he talks about is, okay, how do we manifest that? Is the skills, is the knowledge, but it's also the manners, the attitudes. You as an individual, you have certain attitudes towards and tastes and appreciation for certain things. It could be an appreciation and taste for music, for learning languages, for doing things in certain ways, for thinking logically. And this is also important because going back to antiquity, we learned from the Greeks how to use logic and even appreciation of theater, going back to the Greeks. And even you have the logical axioms that we learn from early on. How to express yourself, how to express your ideas in a clearly way, clearly fashion, logical. When you're writing an article and an essay, we follow certain cultural rules. You don't start writing willy-nilly without any order. We follow certain patterns that we have learned from early on. How you speak, how you express your ideas. And then also we develop that cultural capital in the way we behave. It's called the habitus. Comes from Latin, hence the word habit. And in sociology, habitus is how the interactions that we have every single day with other people. How you talk to people, how you line up, how you set the table, how you eat. How you behave or how you dress, and even all the habits that thanks to the interaction, when we say from early on, don't interrupt the adults, right? Or listen to and how you interact with other people, that part is part of the habitus. And this is something that he talks about. The sociologist, the manifestation of the habitus that we learn from early on how to behave. What are the social conventions? We usually say social conventions, but it's part of your culture. How you drive the car, the rules that you follow. I'll give you an example that comes to mind. In Germany, you have the highway, and then when there is bottleneck, they usually, the drivers go to the left and to the right. And then they leave a hole in the middle of the road empty for ambulances and fire engines. That's cultural. Nobody's forcing them, but as a culture they develop that this is more efficient, and we value that. We value, in this case, to save somebody's life. And then we're going to make room for that. Whereas in other societies, they don't have that. How you, for example, you line up, how you talk to the cashier. This is part of our culture. Even how you dress, or how you, in your house, the paintings you have, the artifacts, cultural artifacts you might have, a vase or a vase, a little statue, what you have on the desk. It will represent somebody that comes to your office, and if they see maybe there is an award or a picture or a painting, and how you set the table, it talks a lot about your culture, and again, you have inherited that cultural aspect. And those are the manifestations of the objects, how you manifest, and even as a society, what are the things that you value as a society? What are the monuments you see? You go to a city, or here where we are, you go to downtown, to the city center, and you see certain monuments. What are the monuments of?
So I have to ask now, because you raise the question of, you see statues downtown, and much like in other places, the statues and the monuments and the appreciation for our old customs and our old history, really, those are being torn down before our eyes. These statues are coming down, they're being defaced. And so to me, that signals there's a clear and demonstrable change in the culture. How do we know, how would you say we know if we're moving in a good or bad direction in terms of culture and cultural values? And what do you even make of this whole phenomenon of people tearing down statues? And because really what they're doing is they're rejecting the old culture that came before them.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is related to something that with the concept of cultural capital. One of the axioms I always use with my students is we understand the things we recognize. And the culture, if you recognize the value of that, the intrinsic or extrinsic value of that object, in this case monuments, then you can appreciate what it represents. I'll give you an example. You might have, somebody might give you a painting in these TV programs, the Antique Pro Show is a very good example of that. When people say, well, here's a painting, and I don't know the value of this painting or of this object or this teapot. And when people say, well, it's a very unique piece of art because it was painted by somebody famous. And we as a society will value that. The same with the monuments. This particular monument represents something that to our society we value. If somebody takes it down, again, it's not part of that understanding of the value of that culture. Something that comes to mind is a relic. If you go to somebody's house and you see the relic of a saint, but you don't understand what the relic represents, and even if they say you have just put into the garbage a relic of St. Stephen or, I don't know, St. Peter, we won't have any relic of St. Peter, but if somebody says, I don't know who St. Peter was. And is this related to your question? First of all, if the people don't understand the value of that, they cannot participate. They cannot enjoy the benefits of that cultural capital. And it happens all the time when somebody has died in the family, they get rid of the possessions and they throw out magnificent pieces of art and very valuable documents that the individual, maybe the son or the daughter, couldn't understand the value of that. And that's why they cannot participate in that cultural background, cultural capital, because literally it's capital. At times it's not tangible, but you can make it tangible when we say that painting is a painting by a famous artist. And if you were to sell it, it will be worth X amount of money. Then in itself you can monetize. And at times, here's another example, when you, as a society, we pay billions of dollars to teach, and we pay instructors, teachers, lecturers, professors, because as a society, we value learning and teaching. And you have to build the institutions, the buildings, the physical buildings. And then how do you manifest that? There's also the objects of that culture. It could be the books, it could be the paintings, it could be the lab, if you are doing experiments. It could be even a plaque. You go into the building and you see this building was opened by so-and-so. So you are representing, you are signifying that we value that. Some people don't, and then they miss out. You see in some countries, you go, for example, in Europe, you turn on the TV, and then they are teaching and they are speaking in different languages. Somebody who has, as a society, valued learning languages from early on, you go to school and they will be teaching 3 or 4 languages. And even if they're not teaching those languages in school, they will be speaking those languages in society, and then you pass on that value. The parents, maybe they say, oh, my uncle is speaking in French, English, or Italian. The other one, my father's friend is speaking other languages. And then you they're all playing instruments. Or traveling, or discussing politics or philosophy, then you learn those values. Some people don't, and then they cannot participate in that. And that's why this sociologist, Bourdieu, talks about that the elite, in the true sense of the word, in the etymological sense of the word, the elite of the society values that. And that's why they send their children to the best schools, or they try to provide them better opportunities. What are the better opportunities? As a culture, I'm going to read to my child every night, and I'm going to discuss politics, philosophy, sciences, and humanities, and we're going to travel, and we're going to invite other people to participate in that cultural environment. And that is going to prepare these young people to do better in life. Not everybody does that. And that's why, for example, in the school system here, it's crucial to expose, well, here and everywhere, to expose those children to the better opportunities, to the best examples of, for example, theater, sciences, humanities, languages, traveling, so that they can not only learn the cultural elements of our society, but participate and then eventually to monetize. And as a society, we value that. If we say, Adam speaks many languages, he knows sciences, he's interested in making videos, and he knows how to use the technology, which is part of our modern cultural capital. When you say this person he's followed by millions of people every week on YouTube, for example, we value that. And because they can create content that could be appreciated by a lot of people. Not everybody does. Yeah, and then also the taking down some statues is to do with political reasons. And you try to, part of the Marxist ideology of trying to get rid of the past, to try to impose one group over another group. But culture creates. Lack of culture doesn't, right? In order to create culture, what's culture? Is the music, is the language, is the everything we are doing, everything we are touching, whether it's the cell phone, the microphone, the electricity, is part of our culture that obviously millions of people have developed over many, many centuries and millennia. And we value that. Even how we talk, how we sit, how we dress, we recognize those signals, those signs to say this is a person who has culture, and other people don't.
So my next question would be, now there are clear and marked differences between cultures, and that's very easy to see. I mean, American music has been largely influential across the world, but there are still pretty clear differences between American music and European music and African music and, Oriental music. But there are, in contrast to that, there are a lot of similarities between cultures. I find it very peculiar that pretty much every culture has specific rules that restrict theft, murder, and in a lot of cases, fornication or adultery. There are rules like this that are very old, and they're very ingrained in a lot of cultures throughout humanity. And I'm wondering, what do you think explains that? What do you think explains the similarities between culture? Is it just human nature? Is it something beyond that? What do you think there is an explanation for the similarities that exist between cultures and where people have overlapping values? Does that have to do with human nature, proximity to others? Because oftentimes different cultures interact with each other. So maybe there's values that kind of cross borders and change over time.
I will go even further, and it's related to your previous question about taking down monuments. In our current culture, we have the lack of, the same as some people are taking down the statues, and it's related to your question, is traditionally, typically, we also value family. And we know from research and common sense and personal experience that once you have a family, once you have a father and mother, it's going to help the children better than if they don't. I mean, there are certain at times circumstances that you cannot have it. Maybe the father has died, or there are circumstances. But all in all, we know for a fact, based on research, but again from experience, that Once you have a family and when society supports that value, that cultural value, and again, how do we support that as a culture? Even at times with popular culture, and it's related to your question, and I want to go further. When you look at the media nowadays, the movies, songs, there's nothing whatsoever supporting the family and supporting fatherhood and motherhood. When was the last time you watched a movie or a TV program or news or debates supporting motherhood, fatherhood, and the family? We don't have it as a society, which is the way I look at it is like, to some extent, mutatis mutandis is taking down that monument. We as a society, we value the past, we value certain concepts, and that's why we erect monuments. And as a society, we know that intrinsically, one of the crucial, most important elements of any society is the family. And you cannot have family without a mother and a father. And then those are the elements, the crucial elements that are supporting the children to do well as individuals, to succeed in life. They are going to pass on the knowledge, the skills, and the values, the habits, good habits, and also the taste. If you grow up in a family when they value respect, how to look after yourself, the self-discipline, being polite, we learn those things at home. And also you have a structure. In the family, you have certain times, meal times, when you say, okay, this is dinner time, you have come back from school or from work, and we're going to sit as a family, that in itself, we don't usually think about that, but there is an order, there's a discipline, you are learning from the adults, the parents, the brothers, the sisters. And as a society, through history, we learn that is is the cornerstone of any society. And it goes back to the question is, we know what works, and that's what are the things that we value. The skills, the knowledge, also being polite, good manners, and having self-respect, the dignity of individual, but you show that also at home. The hierarchy of the family, you are learning from early on how to respect your parents, and then by extension, your siblings and the neighbors and the teachers. But if you don't have that, and in our society, as I said, even in the popular culture, the songs that we listen to, the movies that we watch, we don't have that. They're not being promoted, and then unfortunately there are negative consequences, because there are a lot of young people and adults, they don't see a role model, whereas in other societies they do. In Europe, when you go to Europe, you watch a European program, at times they invite philosophers, or they might invite a theologian or a priest to talk about society, or the things we are talking about right now. And the idea is, this is something that we as a society, as a culture, we value, and keep that in mind. And in other societies, like here in North America, we don't have that. They might invite a philosopher. I remember when I was teaching in the UK, in England, on the BBC, every morning they had a section for 5 minutes, and it was called Thought for the Day. And they used to invite either a clergyman, a philosopher, somebody to inspire, to elevate you for the rest of the day, something to do with ideas, how to do better and how to be a better person. Here in Canada, the CBC has a section which is the laugh of the day, or for the day, a little joke. And I thought, when I saw that, that is very telling about different cultures. In the UK, they value the intellect, trying to do better, be better. And here we value being entertained. And we see that constantly in the popular culture, quote unquote. So the question is, once you recognize that and you value that, then you choose. Okay, what are the songs that I want to listen to? What are the things that are going to help me? What are the books I want to read? What are the skills and the taste that I want to develop? Do I want to develop a taste for fine art, music, for example, fine music, high culture, as we might label it, or just being entertained and without any purpose.
So I want to go back to, you were talking about the family, and you were talking about how in popular culture these days, family is not anywhere in the fore, and it's something that's either taken for granted or it's completely perverted or attacked. And so my question to you is, obviously it's counterintuitive to attack the structure of the family because that's how culture perpetuates itself. You can't have a continuous culture if the people stop reproducing. That's a major aspect of even having a country, having a nation. So my question to you then is, given that it obviously doesn't make sense to be attacking the family, attacking the foundation of culture, as it were, what do you think the socialists and the seditious people who are promoting that agenda against the family, what do you think their alternative will be to the family and in the future? And how could they possibly deal with the repercussions of that? Is there any logic to what they're doing? What are we going to do about that? Because it seems to be that families are waning, birth rates are plummeting. We're looking at possibly civilization collapse or population collapse in probably in my lifetime. So why would they be promoting that sort of agenda? I don't see the logic here. Maybe you can shed some light on that.
It's not logical, and they try to subvert for a long time what we usually say, we call it the moral order. So there is an order, there's a moral code, even in every single family and as a society. And they want, what's the alternative of morality? What is the immoral? And then what's the alternative? What's the opposite of the moral order? Disorder. And it creates chaos. Something that comes to mind when we talk about the family and also marriage. Something that I read a long time ago, there was an article here in this city. There was a young man who came from Latin America, from a sort of, he could have been Mennonite. And he came here to get married, and then there was the family, the marriage. But then for some reason he ended up homeless. And then because he left that marriage, ended up living with other people. And then basically it was awful, but he was killed by people in this house he was staying in. Horrible. But then the question is, why did he, well, there's no excuse, but the fact is that marriage was protecting, it would have protected him. But then he, by not being married, ended up in a very, in a situation when he found himself without no house, no family, and he was vulnerable. And because he was in that vulnerable state, the consequence was dramatic. And you read a lot about that. People who, when they have that marriage with imperfections, the marriage protects you, protects your spouse and protects you. And then if you have children, it protects also intrinsically, it protects the whole family. Now, answering your question, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is it's more expensive for society. It's more expensive. You pay, the example I gave you, you can pay a very high price. Ultimately, in extreme circumstances, you can pay with your life. In less extreme circumstances, you end up with less resources, fewer resources, less money. In a more vulnerable situation, you are being exposed to more dangerous situations. And as a society, it's more expensive. The question that you were asking, why do they get into all of this? At times, is just diabolical. At times it's part of the ideology, but there is no alternative. Is when going back to your question about taking down a monument, it's okay, you have destroyed beauty, you have destroyed part of our heritage, part of our cultural capital, and you are replacing that with what? With nothing. They don't replace it with anything else. You have just destroyed a marriage, or you have just trying to undermine the cultural values. And here's a very good example of that. There was an important figure in part of that movement, socialist, not anarchist as such, Saul Alinsky. He was American, and the National Film Board of Canada made a documentary a long time ago, black and white, about him coming to Canada to give advice how to be a revolutionary to the Rama Indians and to some social workers working in a village, in a small town in Canada. And then they were asking him, Mr. Alinsky, how do we basically subvert the system? And then he was, as a socialist and a community organizer, sounds better. Then he was giving them, basically you have to subvert, make noise, how to disrupt. And then there are different techniques, and actually he wrote a book about that, Rules for Radicals, how to subvert and how to break up some of the order. But in one instance of that documentary, some of the young Rama Indians and the social workers, they were saying, but if we do, Mr. Alinsky, if we do what you're telling us, we're going to destroy the community. There was that moment of, but if we do that, we're going to undermine and destroy the community we want to protect. His answer basically was, I don't care. If you want to get what you want, with the Rama Indians, it was to get rid of the Indian Act. And the social workers, it was just to undermine the social structure and the order. But he couldn't care less because there is no alternative, which is the answer to your question. It's almost somebody who wants to be disruptive for the sake of being disruptive. At times power games, because he was being paid and he was gaining money. And at times we see that in many organizations, even in companies, or it's like playing chess. You always have somebody against you. And at times it's to do with greed, which is one of the 7 deadly vices or capital sins, because it can disrupt and it can create chaos and disorder, and the consequences are bad. Yeah. But the question is, okay, what do we do about it? Well, we recognize what's valuable, and then you individually, that's what you do. You want to do better. You are reading. You go to courses. You take an education. You talk to people who know better, who can influence you in a positive way. And then in your family, with your spouse or fiancé or colleagues, or in the neighborhood, you try to support what is valuable. So we talk about the cultural capital, and then there's also the objects of that culture that we talked about, how we manifest that. At times could be monument, could be the books, paintings, music, literature, theater. Those are the cultural manifestations of our society that in some places, in some societies, is valued more than others. But also there's the institutionalized capital. What do they mean by that? The sociologists, what they mean is, if you want to be an engineer or if you want to be a physician, you have to have a degree. And what is the institution giving you that degree that says, okay, now you are an engineer, now you are a physician, now you are a teacher. And then that cultural capital has been recognized by an institution, and then you can monetize, you can profit from that degree. And in some instances, you cannot really work without that license, especially if you're a nurse, a doctor, an architect. With other professions, you can. But we, as a society, we recognize that. Today is changing. in many organizations, especially when it comes to information technology and the new technologies, you don't have to have a degree from a particular university. Many private organizations are saying, can you develop our website? Can you manage our information technology system? And then if you have the knowledge, then the world is your oyster. You don't have to have this piece of paper from a particular university. It might help you. You might be able to monetize, but it's more to do with the skills. You already have the knowledge. And that's why I think society is changing in a good way in that respect. The new technology has changed it in many ways, because you have access to so much information, so much knowledge, so many skills, thanks to the internet, that before it would have meant to go to the school or to a college or to university or to the library to acquire that. Now you open your phone or your computer and you have the knowledge, the entire knowledge of human civilization at your fingerprint, in front of you, right? Mm. Your fingertips.
Yeah. So my question came back to me. My question would be, so we talked about how there's seemingly no underlying logic of why there are actors that are attacking the family structure, and they're attacking the institution of the family. And you pretty much said that they don't have anything to replace it. So once they've destroyed the things we value in our culture, then there's nothing to replace it, and there's this void. And I'm wondering how this might tie into other things at play right now in the West, especially in Canada, but also in other countries, with the destruction of our values and our order on the one hand, where we're questioning even what bathroom people should be using. Like we are deconstructing and assuming that all of the basic principles and truths are subjective, and we can see where that might lead. But on the other hand, there's this additional danger where we are importing vast amounts of people from countries, particularly those that disagree with us culturally. There, used to be when people immigrated to Canada, they came from countries where at least we shared Christian faith, we shared underlying cultural values. That's not the case anymore. A lot of our immigrants are coming from, I think the number 1 and number 2 countries where people are coming from immigrating to Canada now is China and India. And to me, that's concerning, because on the one hand, you have leaders in this country that are apt on deconstructing our culture. And that's happening at the same time we're bringing people in from vastly different cultures and pretty much giving them the messaging that we don't have a culture here and we don't have any values here. So you can bring your own values that ultimately undermine Christian values. I think that's kind of the crux of the matter, is they're attacking Christianity on 2 fronts. Bring people in and tell them that it's okay to not abide by our culture and our faith. And then on the other hand, we're essentially destroying ourselves from within by rooting out Christianity and demonizing it. What do you make of these phenomenons? Like, are there more forces at play here? And, what are we dealing with?
That's a very complex issue, because it's complex in itself, which is how we behave with other people, or how people behave around us. And there are practical consequences, which is what you are talking about. You see that at work. You see, for example, a university. There have already been situations here in Canada when you go to a classroom and then somebody from a different society says, the professor says, I want you to work in groups. And then when somebody says, I'm not going to work with my female classmates, so because they are women. Mm-hmm. Or somebody at work will say, well, I'm sharing this office, these are real situations. And I'm in a professional context, and then this individual said, well, there's this in this office that woman, she's not married. I don't want her to work in my office. So there are real consequences. We can talk about in a theoretical context, but then the reality hits. And at times you can go to court, and then they might say, well, you cannot discriminate against this person based on sex. Just because she's a woman or she's not married, you cannot say, oh, I don't want to work with this person, or just because my classmate is a woman, I don't want to work with her. In that particular instance, the university said, okay, well, you can do the homework or the project on your own, or you can do it. So they tried to, but which is important, because what this individual was saying is, I don't want to follow the conventions, the social conventions and the values of this society. And then the administrators of the university said, okay, yes, you win, basically, and you don't have to follow that. A few years ago, it was another real case here in the city when some people came from other societies, and they said, we don't want our children to go to music lessons because part of our culture, we don't want them to listen to music, classical music, to be excellent. And then the school division said, that's all right, they don't have to. So the consequences, there are real consequences when you have, for example, in a student accommodation and you have 6 students living in the same apartment, and then you are eating meat and the other person doesn't want you to eat meat, and you only have one fridge. So who accommodates? What do you do? Is your right, do you have the right to do it, or that the other person has the right? There are real consequences, right? Or if you like a glass of wine and the other person says, well, I don't want you to drink wine, and you are sharing the same accommodation, right? Well, you have the right. The other person has also the right, but so there are,
whose values are more important here, right?
And this is something that's and at work it happens, and they say, well, in my religion, I have to pray so many times and I have to have so many breaks during the day, whereas my colleague doesn't. So you, the employer, and then you have to figure out that there are real consequences, and that is a challenge, and I think society tries to figure it out, but ultimately what happens is they are creating elites. And what I mean by that, here's an example. When you say, well, in my culture, in my society, we don't appreciate music because part of our religion, we don't. Okay, that means that somebody who, the general society, we do value classical education, languages, music, and then there are obviously so many people employed by orchestras, and then they create a value as a society, and we pay lots of money and resources and energy to have that. Whereas somebody else says, I don't value that. Or theater, or philosophy, or sciences, or some of the traditions, then what you are doing is you are creating an elite that they might have more opportunities than others. And again, some people have an understanding and appreciation, again, taste. They have educated that taste from early on, and then you get more out of life. And from a personal perspective, you can have more out of, enjoy life more, but also even you can monetize, you can profit that if you already know music, high culture, traveling, reading, languages, sciences, different aspects of science, then you can benefit and you can contribute to society. It's not only you personally, but you can contribute to society because you are going to employ your talent to make society better. So everybody benefits. The problem is, if answering your question, if a lot of people come and they don't share that, then as a society, you are going to pay a price, because maybe in this city, you are not going to have the same talent as other city. and you're not going to have the same cultural artifacts that other city. That's why, for example, when you go to Europe, you go to Europe and you see the architecture, the art, the churches, the cathedrals, the museums, that as a society for millennia they have been developing. Whereas in other culture, in other societies, in other cities, there's not much to see. So even you pay a price, and the question, and then from a practical point of view, what would you do? You have to make a decision.
I mean, I see a real connection here where when you attack the family, especially if you attack fatherhood, I mean, you have to think about what is the role of fathers in society. They set boundaries, they set rules, and they protect. And what I think we're seeing in much of the West is really gynocentrism, where by eradicating the role of the father in society, we no longer have a strong group of men who are protecting their culture and protecting their values and protecting their communities. And I think I'm starting to see now the large scale ramifications of that is if you don't have the cultural value and mentality of protecting what you have, then the consequences are you allow, on the one hand, seditious men to subvert the culture and the values because there's no one left to protect it. And, you know, it's even like comparing, you look at Britain, for example, right now, compared to Japan. In Japan, they have a very homogenous culture. They have values that are not trampled on. They don't accept a lot of immigrants from elsewhere. And the positive effect of that is they are able to protect their culture. When you go to Japan, everything is Japanese and the people are Japanese, and there's a beauty to that. When people travel to Japan, they want to see Japanese culture. When people travel to Turkey, they want to see Turkish culture. When people travel to any given country, they want to see the culture of that country because there's an intrinsic beauty to that. And I think the problem with I honestly want to say the liberalism that's pervasive in the West is that instead of having a homogenous, cohesive, unitary culture of, you know, we are Canadian or we are American, it's we have to tolerate everyone else. This toleration, I think, has stretched to its limits, where in tolerating other people and their values, which are not cohesive with ours, we have to compromise on our values. And we're seeing that. It's, you know, if we have the belief that, you know, you have to have Christian values, like you have to believe that it's wrong to kill, it's wrong to steal, to be a part of our culture. Why shouldn't that be a prerequisite?
Yeah, well, in Japan, in some societies, what they do have, the value is the community. So the community plays, and that's why the way they organize, when you watch the schools, the factories, even in the cities, how they behave, which is part of that habitus that I was talking about earlier on, the things that you learn how you learn by interacting with other people in society, in your group. And then you realize this is acceptable, and this is what you learn. This is acceptable, this behavior is acceptable, this behavior is not acceptable. And in Japan, which is a great example of that, is the value the community. In traditional societies, and back in Spain, for example, you see that, and in Europe, in the countryside, the community takes precedence over the individual. And that's why you have the concept of the commons. In England, and in other parts of Europe, if you had cattle, you could take your cattle to the commons, to the common field, and everybody benefited from that field that it belonged to everybody. Or the forest, if you were a citizen of that particular small town or village, you were entitled to so many trees for winter, But then the part of that forest, it didn't belong to an individual, it belonged to the community. And then as a community, you behave in that way because you are a member of that community. It goes back to Roman times when this idea of cleaning the outside your house, because at that time there was no city cleaning the street for you. So you took the responsibility to clean the front of your house for the common good, for everybody. And you learn that. And that's why, to some extent, even nowadays, here in the city, we do that. You are supposed to look after the front of your front garden or backyard, and you are supposed to cut down the grass, even though it belongs to the city, but you are supposed to look after that. So this idea that you are a member of that community, and in societies such as Japan, the community, the group, takes precedence. Because you are just an individual and your behavior is going to affect the rest of the group. Whereas in other societies, in North America, one of them, usually in Anglo-Saxon societies, is the individual takes precedence, the rights of the individual over the rights of the community. And we usually behave in that way. It's my right, it's what I want. And hardly ever we think of, no, I belong to this neighborhood, I belong to this area, I belong to this city, and my behavior is going to have an impact on that. How I talk, how I behave, if I don't follow the rules, if I don't line up, if I don't clean after me when I go to the restaurant or in the shop. And in other societies, in Japan, it's an example, a beautiful example of that. Or the other example I gave you in Germany, when everybody leaves the middle of the road for the ambulances to go by. So this is something that we learn is part of the cultural capital. We value that, or the values. We value that, and then we learn it. And in some societies, they do have it. In other societies, you see in third world countries, God-forsaken countries, they don't do that. They might not clean the street. So, okay, why? It doesn't come from God. It's you take the responsibility and you go to another society and the streets are spotless. Not a single piece of junk and you go to other cities, including this one, and at times the bus stops or the street is full of, empty papers, bottles. You think, why is this? Not everybody does it, obviously. That's why at times the habitus, the things that we learn, the tastes, the behaviors, the good manners, we learn that, and the bad manners too. So that's why culture is crucial. It's crucial for the survival of the individual and the survival of society, your family, your group, and society at large.
Yeah, and coming back to what I was trying to ask is, given that clearly there are still some cultures out there that are relatively homogenous and they are cohesive, and that's clearly falling apart, or just outright not the case in Western countries, then what I'm wondering is, what exactly do we still have cultural values if there's so many competing interests? Is there any overarching political values, or are we in this constant state of flux because there's so many different cultures under one banner? I'm just trying to make sense of it, because in Japan and in Turkey and in these countries where they are homogenized, it's very easy and obvious that they have one dominant culture. Whereas, especially, and as you said, in Anglo-Saxon countries with that sort of legal system, the emphasis is on I. The emphasis is not on the group or the common good, it's on the individual. And so is this sort of a consequence to that, where we're so focused on the individual that we make that take precedence over our cultural capital?
Yeah.
How do you make sense of that?
Well, and I will add something else to that. Or even the legal system is part of a culture. Mm. At times it goes back to the Roman codes, but also the The Anglo-Saxon they follow a different type of rules.
Correct.
But it's part of a culture.
Yeah.
And there is a fallacy that we can follow into. It's the fallacy of antiquity, the idea of if it's old, if it's traditional, it's good. Depends. Objectively, it can be good, but there are certain practices that are ancestral practices in some societies that are harmful for the individual and for society at large. Honor killing is ancestral, it's traditional, but it kills people. So, or when you say, polygamy, in some societies, they are married to several individuals. And for millennia, we have decided as a society, no, it's better for the individual, especially for the woman, to be married to only one person. That's why traditionally the Catholic Church always implemented this idea that you are married to just one person and one person only. And when you look at the documents from the 16th century, some of the priests, they were trying to implement this idea of monogamy in Latin America when they were the missionaries. They went to Latin America and they were saying, well, in some societies, there's polygamy. How do we try to convince them that monogamy is better? And the idea was it was going to be better for the woman because the man was not going to run off with other women and then they had to look after the children of that woman. So from a practical point of view, you can always argue that there are certain traditional practices and cultural practices that are better than others. And I think society is complex. Even at times, technology changes your culture. I'm thinking of even the electricity. With electricity, that meant that you could have dinner at a later. Instead of having dinner at 5 or 6, then you could have dinner at 8 or 9 or 10. So it changed some of the practices. And with the Industrial Revolution, again, industry, you brought in industry, and because of the industry, and you had now to work in a factory so many hours before it was, now it's in most countries 40 hours a week, before it was more. And you had to commute, even to this day, you have to commute to work in the factory or the industry. And that really changed how you organize yourself as a family. And it has practical consequences. In most cases, negative, because then you cannot see your children as much. And as if you were working from home or working on your farm that was just next door. So there are practical consequences that, again, by even the technology can affect how you behave, your habitus, your habits, how you interact with people. New technology is very much the same now, how you talk to people and your family and your friends. It has affected the way we interact with individuals. But it's interesting because this conversation, this phone call, was about food. And again, food is also part of your culture. And this is something that I can talk about. We talked about the cultural capital, and that's why I extrapolate and then I refer to the Catholic cultural capital, because within the culture you have this subculture, which is the Catholic cultural capital. And how do we see that? It's in everything that the church does. The rituals, the liturgies, the traditions, the devotions, the books, the chant, the music, the hymns, the vestments, how you behave when you go to church, then the kneeling, the sign of the cross, the statues, the incense, how you pray before meals, you pray after meals, you go to spiritual exercises, you have the holy cards, you have the rosary, the brown scapula, the relics, all that, those are the objects of that cultural capital. And it's been transmitted from generation to generation. Even the history of Western civilization, European civilization and Western Europe civilization, without the Catholic Church wouldn't be the same. So where do we see that? Right at the beginning, you look at the history and the origin of the European languages. The first manifestations of those European languages, whether it's Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, French, English, German, goes back to the Catholic Church. In those monasteries, They are the monks who started collecting and writing down the first words and the first texts in those languages. And then not only they created that knowledge, that culture, they preserved that culture and they transmitted that culture. They were writing poetry, they were writing music. The first examples of polyphony in Europe, in Western music, we owe that to the monasteries. And we still have the documents from the first examples of polyphony, that the ones who were composing, well, even the musical notations, we owe that to a monk, Guido di Arezzo. So we know that he was from Arezzo, we know his name, we know exactly what he did, and he's the one who came up, he invented the musical notation that we still use to this day. Even actually the names of the musical notes, he chose the first syllable of a particular prayer. So it's part of that Catholic Christian tradition and culture that we inherited. You go to Europe and the cathedrals, think about the churches, is part of that, the objects, the manifestation of those values and the cultural capital. You were talking about the Christian traditions in this country. It's very much the same. Why do you look after the poor? Who built, for example, the first universities? The first universities we thank and we owe that to the Catholic Church. They're the ones they established the first universities in Europe. Bologna was the very first one, and then they started the first universities in Paris, Oxford, in Spain. And then within a few years, the monarchs were given the right, obviously it was the land of the monarch, the crown, gave the right to build those universities, and then the universities originated in the cathedrals. The bishops were teaching the clergy, and then it was extending to these institutions that we call universities, having this universal knowledge to understand nature, and because it's part of God's creation, and we try to figure out how things work. And even the institutions of the hospitals. You have the first hospitals. Wherever the church went to, for example, in Latin America, or in Asia, they always established the church, the hospital, and the school. Here in Manitoba, it's very much the same. Mm. So we owe that, it's part of that tradition. And when we say, well, what do we mean by Christianity? There are real consequences when it comes to society and knowledge and the transmission of that knowledge, creation of the knowledge, and the preservation of that knowledge.
Yeah. Now, one thing you mentioned earlier had to do with the, I don't want to say moral subjectivity, but oftentimes different cultures have different values because they have different moral values. And so obviously we can make the case that morality is not subjective, and morality comes from God and it comes from natural law. So we have natural and divine law, and that constitutes the moral code. And I don't think that is disputable. However, other religions, false religions, have their own moral codes. And in a lot of cases, they're quite similar to the Catholic moral code. And they either deviate a lot or they deviate in some areas. As Catholics, obviously, we believe that there is only one God, and that all these false religions are...
Not only one God, but unitrino. You have the Holy Trinity in one God.
That's right.
In one.
Yes.
Because some people say, well, we all believe in God. Yes, but we as Christians, we believe in the unitrino God, mm-hmm. that who the Son incarnated, became incarnate.
Yeah.
And it's the only religion that God becomes incarnate.
Right. That, yes, because we have God the Father, there's Jesus Christ, who's the Word made flesh, and the Holy Ghost, which proceeds from the Father and the Son. And
it's crucial because a lot of times we hear, we all believe in God. Yes, but it's not the same God. So it's false. It's almost part of the marketing. It's almost trying to defraud you. Mm. I'm selling you this, and this is the same product as that product. It's like, well, no, it's not. Let's break it down. Let's open it. And then you realize that maybe it's not the same. And here's an example of that.
Precisely, yeah. So given that distinction that we as Catholics have, how can we make the argument that our religious values supersede values from other religions? How do we make that argument, especially if a lot of people believe that they are subjective, that, you know, the Catholic Church can just make up what it believes on any moment? A lot of people say that. A lot of people believe that, and they think that the Catholic Church does things arbitrarily. Yeah. How do we...
by the fruits you will know them. And the proof is in the pudding. It's the same as people say, what's the value of knowing languages? What's the value of going to studying, or knowing how to read or write or mathematics? The result, you see the results, and the proof is you consider the results. And the same with the Catholic Church. You look at the history of civilization, what the Catholic Church has contributed because of the understanding of how we organize ourselves as a society, as a culture. And going back to the example I gave you, you have more than 500 years of creating knowledge, culture, preserving that knowledge for future generations, and transmitting that knowledge in the monasteries, the cathedrals, society, and how Christian societies, the Catholic societies, organized for millennia. The laws, how they supported society, the vulnerable, those who, for example, they have lost their families, the hospitals, the orphans, the elderly. And I'll give you an example of that. I'm from Burgos, in the northern part of Spain, in Castile. And in the 15th century, the Archbishop of Burgos built one of the residences for the elderly. It was called, at that time, asylum, which actually is a beautiful Latin word because it protects in this case, the elderly people, the vulnerable. That's why, but nowadays the word asylum, I understand they can have a negative connotation. It might have, because of the culture, it has changed it.
Oh, that's because of the culture.
Yeah, because the word asylum, you are protecting you are giving, that's why we people say, this person is seeking asylum. You know, the asylum seekers. They are seeking the protection of the state. So in the 15th century, the Archbishop built this residence for the elderly, which is still to this day is still standing and is run under the auspices of the Catholic Church in Burgos and also the regional government, but it's still for the elderly. The Jesuits had a school. I was educated in a school under the Jesuits back in Burgos, and then they built a school, and then actually the Jesuits have been expelled from Spain on a couple of occasions. The state expelled them, but then they built a school, and then also you have a hospital run under the auspices of the Brothers of St. John of God, founded in the 16th century by St. John of God, Portuguese, who worked in Granada and in Spain, and built this religious organization, this institute, to look after the sick, the infirm, the cripple. And then in my case, in my family, you have an example of somebody who was educated in a school run by the Jesuits. My mother, at the end of her life, was in this residence under the auspices of the Catholic Church, established in the 15th century. They have the university, they have a seminary, they have the cathedral. And then the laws of Spain, traditionally, typically, they were imbued by this Catholic ethos of preserving, again, the values, what it was good for the individual, for the family, and for society. And that's an example of that Catholic civilization that worked for millennia. And actually, literally, you go back millennia, and it has helped. So how do we know that? Because it worked. It worked, and the examples I gave you of these institutions, if it hadn't been for those institutions, in my little hometown, we wouldn't have had those hospitals. In the 15th century, as they were building this beautiful Gothic cathedral, there were 15 hospitals. Some of them for the pilgrims, they were going to go to Santiago de Compostela, and others. Okay, some of the hospitals only had 4 beds. We're talking about the 15th century. One of them, the Royal Hospital, it was outside the city. It was run by monks, and they had more than 80 beds. So there's an example of the universities, the schools, the hospitals, the residences for the elderly, and also the laws trying to support and build society and culture. Because as they were developing, for example, the cathedral, magnificent cathedral, but again, it provided, nowadays we call it sustainable development, because it provided thousands and thousands of people the employment, but also not the employment, the skills. You have to employ lots of people, masons, architects, carpenters, painters.
Stonemasons, right?
Stonemasons.
Yeah.
Stonemasons to build those cathedrals, and then they are providing for, not only for a few dollars, but you are providing employment for 20 years or more. And then they are passing on those skills and those professions. So that's how society worked, and it worked very, and they built civilization. Without Christianity, Europe wouldn't be Europe, and wouldn't have been the lighthouse of civilization as we know it.
But then, people would argue that there were other countries and other nations and empires achieving similar things without Christianity. So even though the Catholic Church may have done all these good things, like providing asylum, building charities, building seminaries, education, they can be accredited for a lot of that, and rightly so. But, does that still mean that Christianity is, couldn't Islam or Hinduism or any other worldly religion, couldn't they have been just as attributable to the successes in other places? I mean, even look at the Ottoman Turks in the 1500s. They were a vast empire, and they conquered into Europe.
The Roman Empire also.
Correct. So how do we,
Well, yes, and the Roman Empire, it's a good example of that. They also, they got rid of lots of civilizations and cultures, but then they replaced them with the Roman culture, that it has influence even to this day when it comes to legal system, how we organize ourselves, literature, theater, you name it. Yes, and at that time it was the Roman Empire, and then all I know is that in Western civilization it was thanks to Christianity. When Christianity arrived in Latin America, they replaced some of those societies, or they imbued practices and customs that they were actually some of the civilizations, as we know, the Mayan civilization, brutal, very bloody civilization. Now they are finding in some archaeological sites the human sacrifice of millions and millions, and how this Indian tribe killed other Indian tribe. So we usually have this picture of everything was hunky-dory, and it was the perpetual Indian, that everything was just...
Well, it was a utopia until the white man came along.
And we know that for a fact that wasn't the case. But there's always a conflict of any group and civilization. Bottom line is it going to work? And what are the benefits? As I said, we're in Winnipeg in the 19th century, basically there was nothing here. And then when the first colonists came here, and the Catholic Church opened the first church, the first hospital, when you read the diaries of the nuns, they were going through pests, floods, drought, and it was so much poverty. There was nothing here, and then they had to make a living. And the question is, how do you organize yourself as a society? And what are the values that you're going to bring in inhospitable land? And then at that time, it worked pretty well, in a very rustic manner, because there was nothing. Even when the nuns built the first hospice and the first schools for the children here, there were no buildings made of stone. And actually, the Aboriginals, the Indians, when they saw the building is still standing, they never seen such a big building in their lives. So that in itself is a manifestation, an object of that culture that you're bringing in. And with that is the care, the healthcare, the practices, medication, medicines, and then the humanities, the other languages, music, books, literature, that is part of that culture. And on top of that, the technology. The railway here in this country, it had a huge influence. You have to have that development.
So I think we should probably wrap up pretty soon. So do you have any closing thoughts?
Yes, the closing thought is we are our culture, and how we sit at the table, how we set the table, how we talk, how we think, the things, our tastes, our manners, the things we do, the things that we use, all the objects, how we dress, is part of our culture. And that culture determines who you are, and it could be the vehicle to succeed in life as an individual and as a society.
Do you think that it seems that we're losing a lot of our culture and the things that give us that identity? And so what can we do to restore culture, do you think? What do you think we can do as Catholics, to make sure that culture, the good parts of our culture that are foundational to our country, that those things survive?
Choose what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful. And you, based on your culture, you discern this is good, this is true, and this is beautiful. And if it's not beautiful, and if it's not true, and if it's not good, objectively, then you can disregard that and aim for something that is better and go higher. Quae sursum volo videre. I want to see what is beyond and what is higher. And we do that every single day. The things you listen to, the things you read, the conversations you have, the people you interact with, how you live in your house, how you start your day. You can start your day you can make yourself a nice cup of coffee, and then look after and do the dishes and make your bed and look after yourself, and how you present yourself, not only for your own sake, because of your own dignity, but also for the respect and the dignity of the people you're going to see.
Beautifully put.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus. Okay.
Great.
All right. Done.
Well done, man.